In our last video, we talked about forage yield and quality with summer stockpile tall fescue. In this video, we will discuss how summer stockpiling fits within a grazing system. To help us, we first asked David Fisk how he has used summer stockpiling to extend the grazing season.
Well, what we typically do, we typically can get 50, 60 plus days of grazing out of our summer stockpile. That with our fall and winter stockpile grazing, we can typically graze at least 275 days a year. In good conditions, we can get that up to 300 days of grazing a year. And so that minimizes your hay feeding to 60 to 75 days. So from a cost standpoint, that's a tremendous savings, grazing versus hay feeding. So we think it's a very good concept and it has worked very well here at the research farm.
Here are a few factors to consider before implementing summer stockpiling on your farm. Electric fence and water sources must allow for stockpiling and strip grazing. This may include infrastructure such as division fencing, electric fence chargers, polywire or polytape, and temporary fence posts. The ability to rotate livestock among paddocks or pastures is critical to manage the components of the summer stockpile system. Evaluate current stocking rate. For most areas of Virginia, the overall stocking rate should be no less than 2 acres of pasture per cow as part of a rotationally grazed system. A stocking rate much heavier than this will likely exceed the carrying capacity of a summer stockpiled system. To better visualize how one may implement summer stockpiling, let's take a look at an example. Here we have a 100-acre pasture divided into 8 paddocks, each about 12.5 acres. The 100 acres is stocked with 50 fall calving beef cows. In the spring, we set aside 25% of the total acreage, or 2 of the paddocks, as our summer stockpile. Grazing will be deferred on this portion from spring green up to mid-August. This area is shown in green. During this same time period, the remaining paddocks shown in red are rotationally grazed. As August approaches, grazing is concentrated on a portion of the rotationally grazed paddocks to prepare them for fall stockpiling. In this example, 50 acres, or 50% of the total pasture acreage, is being set up for fall stockpiling, shown in red. This leaves a small portion of the rotationally grazed pasture to rest. In mid-August, we then begin to strip graze the summer stockpiled pasture, now shown in red, moving fence about every 3 days to ration out the forage. Typically, the summer stockpile will last about 2 months. While strip grazing is taking place on the summer stockpile, other acreage, now shown in green, will be fertilized with nitrogen and set aside to accumulate fall growth. A portion from our summer rotation continues to rest. After grazing is completed on the summer stockpile, cattle are then moved onto the portion of the summer rotation that is not part of the fall stockpiled acreage, shown here in red. By now, this pasture has not been grazed for well over 2 months and often has enough forage to carry cattle through November. In good years, cattle can often finish out the fall by grazing the regrowth on the summer stockpile that was grazed first in the process. Finally, sometime in December, livestock begins strip grazing the 50 acres of fall stockpile which has accumulated thanks to a well-managed summer stockpile. In this way, all the parks work together to form a system that has typically extended the grazing season about 90 days, often through January or later. Just as with summer stockpiled pasture, limit grazing with temporary electric fencing is critical to stretch the forage supply. On the McCormick farm, cattle on stockpile are given about 2 to 3 days worth of pasture at a time. As cattle are strip grazed in this way, each new allotment of pasture therefore sees a stock density of about 60,000 pounds of live weight, or about 40 cows per acre.
We typically start grazing our summer stockpile somewhere around mid-August. And we do that when we shut the animals out of the pasture that we're going to put fertilizer on for fall grazing, fall winter grazing. To maximize the utilization, what we do is we strip graze that summer stockpile. We give them typically enough grass to last 2 to 4 days, and then we don't install a back fence, but there's a forward fence to keep them from grazing only what we allow them access to. By doing this, we feel we probably maximize the utilization of that grass. Typically, the 25% that we set aside for summer stockpiling will last us 50 to 60 days, depending on weather conditions, sometimes more. And then in addition to that, there's 25% of that forage that has not been summer stockpiled, but has been allowed to rest and regrow for anywhere from 60 to 90 days during this whole process. And so at the conclusion of the grazing of summer stockpile, typically in mid-October, mid to late October, we have that other 25% of the forage that we can then graze and usually get 30 to 45 days of grazing out of that. And so by the time we graze our summer stockpile, that forage that's been allowed to accumulate 60 to 90 days, it's usually into mid or late November, early December before we have to start grazing that 50% of the pasture that we've set aside and applied nitrogen to for our fall stockpiling.
Here are the steps we recommend to take to successfully implement summer stockpiling on your farm. Step 1. Early spring. Select pasture to be summer stockpiled. It is a recommended practice to rotate the location or pasture that is stockpiled from year to year. Remove cattle from the selected area from spring green up until mid-August. Plants should be allowed to mature and set seed without grazing or mowing. If weeds are a concern, you may wish to consider another pasture for the stockpile. As the growing season progresses, leafy regrowth will accumulate below the canopy, and by August, stems and seed heads will dry down and begin to deteriorate. Step 2. Late summer. Begin strip grazing the summer stockpile in mid-August. Again, maximum efficiency can be obtained by using strip grazing methods and allocating about 1 to 3 days of fresh pasture forage at a time. Step 3. Fall. Evaluate other pasture conditions and determine if and where a fall nitrogen application would be beneficial for fall stockpiling. Allow for fall stockpile pasture growth to accumulate while cattle herd is grazing the summer stockpile. And that concludes this video. In our next video, we will talk about fescue toxicity in the summer stockpile.